Everybody, good evening, good evening. My name is Kristie Puckett-Williams, and I am the Statewide Campaign for Smart Justice Manager with the ACLU of North Carolina. And I'm joined tonight by my good friend and esteemed colleague, Daniel Bowes, who serves as the Director of Policy and Advocacy. And so we're going to talk tonight about the People's University. We launched the People's University as a direct response to the protests of last summer, because what came out of those protests for Black Lives Matter was the need to reevaluate how we spend money in our communities, quite frankly, right? And so there were lots of calls to defund the police, and then we saw a response by here in our state legislature to those calls for defund the police. And so what we decided was that there needed to be an education of the people around civics and around the budget so that they could have a deep understanding of what was happening at the local level and at the state level, so that they could understand and be empowered enough to be their own advocates about what their community needs. Because what we understand is that the cookie cutter solutions that we have now, which end in people being incarcerated and their freedom being restricted and their civil liberties being revoked, that is prescribed by policy and by law. And that the inequities that we see that exist in the system is, again, prescribed, and that the scarcity that we see is prescribed because there is an overinvestment in police and policing and the criminal legal system in some areas, and a total defunding of our communities. And so what we wanted everyone to do is to attend this university, to engage in the ways in which you can. For those of you who cannot attend all the time, if you register, we will send the recording to you. We will also be sending out some post readings that you read in between events so that you have a better understanding of what we talked about in this, in the webinar. And then we will have future events that we will let you know about. And each event will build upon the knowledge that everyone has. So tonight's event called Not Yo Mamas Civics 101. Now, why is it Not Yo Mamas Civics? Why is it not just regular civics, Kristie? Well, because some of our mamas, they were Black or brown, probably didn't even get this information. Because as we know, Black people have historically been locked out of the government and the civic process. And those, people are continuously today, continue to be marginalized and tried to lock out of the system. And so we know that if you have parents who were not Black or brown, they probably got this education about how government works, but they didn't get it through the lens of racial equity. And so Daniel and I will be talking about this through a racial equity lens. All right, so Daniel, do you have anything you want to say?
No, just excited to talk about the issues, talk about the dynamics between different government actors, because and the constituents I represent, and glad to provide this resource, because I think that what we see out there is that people at a very sort of base level understand that something is wrong and that something has to change, but they can't tell exactly who is the actual decision maker because everybody's pointing fingers at at somebody else. And so this is really meant to lay a foundation so that people will know who exactly is responsible for the harms, the sort of public policy harms that we see in our community. So I'm glad to be here with you, Kristie.
Thank you. Glad to have you join us. Daniel has been a lobbyist at the legislature for the last 10 years. And so it brings a wealth, of knowledge to talk about historically what has happened at the state legislature and in local communities, the impact it has on local communities. And he is what I like to think of as a forecaster. He's like our weatherman. He helps us to determine what is the political temperature, what is going to happen. It's going to be rainy, cloudy. We're going to have a good day. We're going to have a bad day. Daniel is our meteorologist at the ACLU around the temperature of the legislature, because it changes frequently, y'all. It changes frequently. I mean, some things we just can't even explain. I mean, you have to be there to understand it. Am I lying, Daniel? You just got to be.
No, you're not lying, but I've never felt so flattered to be called a meteorologist. That is quite a compliment there.
me and my analogies, I try to make the people understand where I'm coming from. So yes, as to Daniel's point, this is meant to be a foundational understanding. We didn't want to assume that anyone had this information or didn't have this information. We know that some of you, this will be a review, and for some of you, this will be the first time that you may be hearing some of this. And that's okay, because we will be taking questions at the end. So Daniel and I will try to go through this information, not quickly, but remember, we're going to send it to you and we will be working together over the foreseeable future, because as the way, especially our local budgets work, the local government begins to start in looking at their budgets in January, and then they generally have a vote. They work on it all the way through January to like pretty much the summer, like June, July, they start voting to implement it. And what we would love to see happen is at the end of this educational series, not so much the end of it, but once we get all of our foundational things happening together, we will then create a vision for legislative policy that addresses the needs of our individual communities and a budget that reflects the needs of that community. And it will be the people's budget and the people's legislative policy that will be curated by you all to fit into your individual communities. And you can push for that. We'll help you advocate around those things. And we also will have some elected officials who will be joining us, not to try to get our votes, y'all, because it's not that, for them to talk about the factors that they consider when they're thinking about a budget or when they're thinking about a policy or a law. What are the things that impact their decisions? So I know that the chat is probably going to be blowing up. Just know that we will address the chat as well as the Q&A feature throughout this presentation, all right? So our agenda for the night, we're going to talk about what is policy, how does it really work, who makes decisions, like who's who in government. We'll talk about the government agencies and their power, voting, does your vote count and influence policy? And then we'll talk about processes to creating change through policymaking. All right, so let's get started. What is policy and how does it really work? So public policy is what the government does or does not do about a problem that comes before them for consideration and possible action. A public official can be anyone from school officials to city council members, county supervisors. All of those people who work for the government represent the government. So what is a law? It's a system of rules established by a legislative body that a community recognizes as regulating the actions of its members and which it may enforce by the imposition of penalties. And penalties can range from things as minor, and which is not really minor, as fines and fees, or it can be as major as spending lots and lots of time inside of a jail, prison, or other detention center or other carceral facility. And so we have three branches of government here in the United States. We have the legislative branch that makes the laws, and that includes Congress, and Senate is comprised, it's Congress, and then the Congress is comprised of the Senate and the House of Representatives. There's the executive branch. They carry out the laws. That's the president, the vice president, and the cabinet. And then the judicial branch interprets the laws. That's the Supreme Court and other federal courts. And the judicial branch, when they interpret the law, it then becomes case law. And so it establishes, now Daniel, because I'm getting ready to mess that all up. Case law is what?
It establishes precedent in a lot of situations. The idea that you need some sort of continuity in how things are interpreted. And so, and that there needs to be a deference given to what came before. And so it's the case law does create basically law, but there is some sort of limitation on it, that it generally cannot just be out of left field. It has to be tied to history and legislative intent, other things like that. And I'll just add to what you said that, this is our system of government is both sort of the federal government and state governments is sort of set forth in constitutions. And so the United States has a constitution and a Bill of Rights. And so those are two of our founding documents. And so when we talk about law and these different branches, that's where it comes from. That's sort of the initial social contract that's been established. And so it all derives from there.
Right. And so what we like to think about when we think about the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, that those things exist, but oppression still thrives in this country despite those documents, right? And so that's the part that's not your mama's, y'all, right, y'all? So not just that we have a constitutional Bill of Rights, but the oppressions that Black, brown, and otherwise marginalized communities feel, they feel those things despite those documents existing, okay? So when people like to tout those things as like the answer to oppression, it's like, actually, I'm oppressed right now, and those things have been here my entire life, all right?
Oof, you're trying to get me started on this, Kristie. I do want to point that out. That is exactly right, that, the Constitution is a document that's obviously hundreds of years old, and, it has some great language in it. But what we've seen over time, and some principles and values, but what we've seen over time is that it is very much attached to the society that exists at that time and the values that are being elevated at that time. So every time in our society that white supremacy has been elevated, the words of the Constitution has been used to justify that. As society has become acknowledged more and more discrimination and inequities, the Constitution has been used to follow that and put it in the law. And so very much instead of our salvation, a lot of times what the Constitution is a mirror back on who we are as a society at any given time. And so I certainly agree with you, Kristie, that if you are looking for the Constitution to be our salvation, then I think we're in trouble. I will say that there are, there's a federal Constitution, and then each state has a Constitution. And so, the North Carolina Constitution was actually set up in the 1970s. And so it's not necessarily that these things are hundreds of years old. Yeah, I'll stop there.
My whole life, I was born in 79. I just had to say that real quick. Okay, so policy versus law. Law is just one type of policy, y'all. Other policies include internal agency policies, executive orders, administrative rules and regulations. A policy can change a lot before it becomes law. And we see that happen all the time. At the beginning of a session at the legislature, we will see a bill introduced, and then it will go through sometimes so many changes that it doesn't even resemble what was originally presented, like at all, right? And so once a policy becomes law, though, it's very difficult to change it. So a law is like power that we take and freeze in time. It is power like frozen in time is how I like to think about it.
Well, and Kristie, I want to congratulate you again for your advocacy and support of Senate Bill 608, which is a perfect example of this, where, theoretically, well, not theoretically, like there is a Department of Public Safety policy that limits the use of shackling of pregnant people in prison. Now, a policy can be changed by the agency itself. It doesn't carry as much weight as law. And so, what many stakeholders, including Kristie, who was very much out in front of this, did over the last several years was take the anti-shackling policy that DPS had and improved it, and then introduced it as a bill. And then today they had a final vote so that it passed the House unanimously after already passing the Senate. And so, as Kristie said, that law is going to, it's going to be harder to pull that back, now that it is a law. And also, the best thing about that is it expanded the reach of the policy. And so that now it just doesn't, it's not an internal DPS policy, it applies to DPS and local jails.
All 100 jails, all 100 counties, y'all. So this is huge for people who are incarcerated to have a guarantee of some measure of humanity and dignity while they're incarcerated. And so there was also a really bad law that was passed today, but it goes to the governor's desk that we hope he will veto it, which is House Bill 805, which seeks to chill our First Amendment right to protest and free speech, and is a Jim Crow 2.0. So while we have some wins, the work of the legislature is always push and pull. For every 10 steps forward, we take 25 back, seemingly sometimes. So y'all, we're getting ready to go through how does an idea become a law in North Carolina? And Daniel, how do you say the word? It's a bicameral system. I can never get it right. That's the right way to say it, bicameral system.
I'm still saying facade, so I don't know. I always, so yes, I think it is bicameral though. That was my first week at Duke. They were like,
okay.
facade.
Oh, for like facade. Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
Sorry, I didn't have fancy people talking around me. I just read the word.
Okay. So how a bill becomes a law in North Carolina. And just know that the way that a bill becomes a law in North Carolina is not how a bill becomes a law everywhere. There are some states where this just is not how it happens at all. So in North Carolina, a bill that starts, it can either start in the House or in the Senate. And how does that even happen? So a concerned citizen, a group of people, an organization, a state agency, or even a legislator themselves suggest the legislation, and they author a bill. The bill is filed, it gets a bill number and becomes public. It then gets assigned to one or more committees. Those committees consider the bill and then they recommend further action. And then they have a full debate in their chamber, whether the House or the Senate, and they make amendments to the bill. They vote on its passage. And if it's approved, it goes to the other chamber. So if it's in the House, it goes to the Senate. If it's the Senate, it goes to the House. Same thing happens on the other side. The bill is assigned to one or more committees. Committees consider the bill and recommend further action. Then they have full debates on their side and they make amendments and they vote on the passage of the bill. If the bill has no amendments, once it's made it to the other side, it is sent to the governor. Okay, we're gonna come back. That's generally not what happens. It generally has lots of amendments on both sides. So if it was amended, then it goes to the place where it originally started. So if it started in the House, it goes back to the House. If it started in the Senate, it goes back to the Senate. When it goes back to the chamber that it came from, if the House or the Senate accepts those changes, it's sent to the governor. If they do not accept those changes, which is like they don't concur, then it goes to a conference committee of either the House and the Senate members, and they resolve the differences in private closed door meetings. And then they adopt a conference report. After that happens, it's sent to the governor. Once it goes to the governor can sign that bill, or the governor doesn't have to sign the bill and it becomes law in 10 days. Or the governor can veto the bill. If the governor vetoes the bill, it returns to the House where it originated, either the House or the Senate. 3/5 of members present in the House and Senate vote to override the governor's veto, or they vote to sustain the veto. If they vote to override, the bill becomes law. Okay. So I know that was very quick, and this will be, again, available to all of you. It's part of a website that a microsite that we are developing so that you can have access to it, so you can reference it when you need to. And so that's how a bill becomes law. So who makes decisions? We have to talk about roles in government, because Daniel made a very good point earlier. Often in this work as an advocate, people reach out to us all the time and ask us for help. And they will tell us all the things that they've done, all the people they've talked to. And oftentimes they have talked to so many people who just gave them the runaround and told them, oh, you shouldn't talk to me. You need to talk to Jim over here. Don't talk to Jim, talk to Sally over here. And they just are spun out sometimes by the time they get to us. And when we talk to them and we figure out what their issue is, there are oftentimes we recommend that they speak to someone who they have already spoken to, who already gave them the runaround, who told them that actually that's not my job, as a way of not being accountable and of not being, confronted about an issue that a person may have. So we hope that this information that we are about to present helps people understand who's responsible for what. And so when they have issues, you feel empowered to engage these elected officials and government representatives in meaningful ways. So again, we talked about the president. Y'all know the president is the head of state, the government, commander-in-chief, the Army, Marine, Navy, Air Force, Space Force, I'm sorry, I'm learning something myself, and I typed it, and Coast Guard. Under Article 2 of the Constitution, the president is responsible for the execution and the enforcement of the laws created by Congress. And the Congress, again, is a bicameral system, which means it has two branches, the House and the Senate. Congress makes the laws that influence our daily lives, y'all. It holds hearings to inform the legislative process. It also conducts investigations. Remember those impeachment trials last year that happened? They happened in the Congress chambers. They also serve as the voice of the people in federal government. So again, Congress consists of two bodies, the Senate. The Senate maintains several powers to itself. It ratifies treaties by a 2/3 supermajority vote and confirms the appointments of the president by a majority vote. And the consent of the House of Representatives is also necessary for the ratification of trade agreements and the confirmation of the vice president. And in the House, as per the Constitution, the House makes and passes federal laws. The House is one of Congress's two chambers. Again, the other is the Senate, and part of the federal government's legislative branch. The American judicial system is a federal system with a central federal government and individual governments for each of its 50 states, as Daniel told us earlier. Although there are important differences between federal courts and between the various state court systems, they do share some common characteristics. Supreme Court. It functions as a last resort tribunal. Its rulings cannot be appealed. It also decides on cases dealing with the interpretation of the Constitution. For example, it can overturn a law passed by Congress if it deems it unconstitutional. And Supreme Court appointees are there for life. And Daniel, if I'm not mistaken, so are federal court judges. They have lifetime appointments as well, correct?
Yeah.
All right, so in the federal system, judges are appointed and they are there for life. Daniel, you must have added that because I was like, what? Okay, so governor, did y'all lost the audio, someone said? Can you hear me? Okay, the governor is the head of state and the head of government of the North Carolina. The governor directs the executive branch of the government and is the commander in chief of the National Guard. Daniel, do you want to talk about this next part?
Yeah, North Carolina is pretty unique in that we have a divided executive power. So ever since Democrats had control of the state legislature for 100 years before 2010, and there were Republican governors. And so what you saw was when there was a Republican governor, the legislature did what they could to take away their power. So long before people started attacking Cooper and taking away his powers, Democrats were taking away the Republican governor's powers. And so that's sort of an ongoing issue. But one dynamic in that is in the 1970s, when they created the new Constitution, they actually divided up the executive power, that whether if you were talking about the national government or other states, these would basically be agencies that the governor would control. But instead in North Carolina, they made them separate elected positions. And so we have a Secretary of State that you can vote for, the auditor, treasurer, superintendent of public instruction, the commissioner of insurance. All those positions are part of the Council of State, which the governor chairs, but he cannot directly dictate to those individuals. So again, in this regard, this is very unique to North Carolina and is a dilution of the governor's power compared to other states and compared to the federal government.
And Daniel, this may be a little tangent, but I read somewhere the other day that the lieutenant governor used to have more power, but the Democrats took the power from the lieutenant governor.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think they were quite as ruthless and callous as the radical conservative legislature is now, but they were ruthless, if not as much, almost as much. And so, yes, this is power, protects itself and is ruthless. So this is not definitely a partisan thing.
Yeah, and just to remind everybody, the ACLU is nonpartisan. So the state legislature, the legislative branch makes laws for North Carolina. It is made up of, again, the Senate and the House of Representatives, which together are known as the General Assembly. The legislature meets biennially, and all members are elected for 2-year terms. And so on the odd years, there is a long session, and on the short years, there's a short session. The way that it's supposed to work is in the long session is where like all these bills are introduced and all these things happen, all these great, ways to make North Carolina great are introduced and passed. And then in the short session, they're supposed to be like, how do we finance all those things that we passed last year, kind of like more budget focused. But because our General Assembly is a hot mess at all times. We have a perpetual session that doesn't ever really seem to end. So it's supposed to start in January and end by the middle of the summer, right, Daniel? Like June, July, it's supposed to be done?
Generally, that is because it is a part-time legislature. Like, one thing about the legislature is they only get paid $13,000 a year because it is, and it hasn't been increased. And you would think like, oh, why are they, being so unfair to themselves? But in fact, they actually keep it that way so that a person who has to actually feed themselves off of, getting a wage cannot be a legislator because you just can't afford it. And so it means that only independently wealthy individuals can do that. But theoretically, it was supposed to be for even the long session was 6 months. The short session was 2 to 3 months. The main part of the long session was to create a budget, vote on it, and then leave, and then adjust it if you needed to in the short session. And instead, as Kristie said, what we see is, we expect this session to go on. I think right now we're the only sort of part-time legislature that is still meeting in the entire country. I think all the other ones have already wrapped up their business. A lot of them have specific end dates. North Carolina does not have a specific end date, and it just sort of keeps on going, as Kristie said.
Perpetual. So someone said, what is the role of the Lieutenant Governor, Daniel? And I would describe the role of the Lieutenant Governor as a tiebreaker in North Carolina. That's generally like they can go out here and say stuff and do stuff, but what would
Yeah, exactly. I mean, exactly. And it's the same dynamic that the Lieutenant Governor used to be a lot more powerful. They had their power stripped away. And so in a lot of ways, they are a cheerleader, that it is a mainly ceremonial position, except sometimes, they preside over the Senate, and there's some power there, but it is largely a ceremonial position.
But we have seen our Lieutenant Governor this year weigh in on House Bill 324, the critical race theory bill. No, it wasn't. It was Senate bill. Wasn't it a Senate bill, Daniel? Wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
it was House Bill 324, which is an example of, we showed this sort of whole policy of how a bill becomes a law. And basically, the main thing that should have showed y'all is there's 1,000 ways to kill a good idea or to insert a bad idea and sort of ambush the legislative process. And that's what happened with House Bill 324, which was, I think, a bill on charter schools until, the last vote before it went to the House. They completely gutted it, changed it, and made it about critical race theory.
All right, so we're going to keep moving through so we can get to all the questions at the end. So state government court system, we have the Supreme Court, we have the Court of Appeals, and we have the circuit courts. The Supreme Court of the state of North Carolina is the state's highest appellate court. The primary function of the Supreme Court is to decide questions of law that have arisen in the lower courts and before state administrative agencies. And last year, our court system in North Carolina changed drastically, would you not say, Daniel?
Exactly, because there is a different aspect to this, which is that the Chief Justice also presides over the administrative office of the courts, which is in some ways the greatest power of the Supreme Court. That's the rules and practices and accessibility. A lot of it is what it's about of the district and superior courts that you see across the state. And so it was the Chief Justice who was deciding what are the COVID protocols for all the state courts. What is it? A lot of the times when we're talking about expunctions and other sort of access to relief issues, it depends on the Chief Justice to make those decisions. And so the administration part of it is just as important, but it's completely unknown to people as the judicial side of it.
Thank you for that, Daniel. Trying to make sure I didn't go too far. Hold on. Doing a lot. Hold on, y'all. Sorry. You're going to see my whole presentation in a minute. All right. So city government. So this is where we get into your local. Oftentimes we see lots of ads in presidential election years, and we see lots of engagement around voting and just having these conversations around politics. And people pay lots of attention to what's happening at the national level. And where we don't see a lot of attention being paid a lot of times is at the local level. And the local city government and your county government have I would think, the greatest impact on your life and the quality of your life in some ways. So city council, though the city councilors generally act as the legislative branch of the city government, as well as its policymaking body. The council looks to the city's goals, major projects, and infrastructure improvements, ranging from community growth to land use to finances and strategic planning. The mayor oversees a city's main departments, including the police, fire, education, housing, and transportation departments. At the same time, their responsibilities vary depending on the local power structure. The city manager oversees all administrative tasks necessary for the city to operate. They are hired by the city council. They supervise the city departments. They maintain the city budget and represent the municipality in a variety of settings. They research issues important to the city and advise the mayor and the council on the best course of action. Police chiefs are appointed, or they can be elected in some places, but here in North Carolina, they're hired. And they are entrusted with running the entire police department. And in that role, they report directly to the mayor or governor, analyzing their department's response to area crime and implement improvements while overseeing the direction of law enforcement as a whole. They truly answer to the city manager in North Carolina. That's who they really answer to.
The main thing there is that everybody thinks the mayor is a powerful figure. Do not start with the mayor. Go to, you can start with them, but you're going to need need to find a stronger decision maker. And a lot of times that is, a theme in American government is sort of the expansion of the administrative state, whether you're talking about the federal level or the local level. And in some sense, so not exactly what that's talking about, is the city manager and the staff have an incredible amount of power.
Yes, they do. Yes, they do. So county government, county commissioners set the county's property tax rate, and they adopt their own budget each year. The Board of County Commissioners also established the county policies by adopting regulations and local laws that are called ordinances. In North Carolina, all of 100 counties use the council manager form of government and the commissioner manager form of government. County managers, their duties include creating and reviewing budgets from the different departments, discussing local issues with those department heads, clients, and the public, attending public hearings and city council meetings, and being present during emergency situations. I think it meant county commission meetings, not city council meetings. And so there are sheriff's departments, and there are also county police departments. Now, that doesn't happen in every county, but I know for sure that I live in Charlotte, and next to us is Gaston County. Gaston has the Gastonia Police Department. They have the Gaston County Police, and they have the Gaston County Sheriff's Department. And so some counties have both a county police and a sheriff's office. But they are responsible for law enforcement on the county level. They ensure that all local, state, and federal laws are followed. Those officers perform a similar role to that of the police. The actual elected sheriff has a similar role to that of the police chief in a municipal department. They manage a department in charge of protecting people and property, and they are there to maintain order, not protect and serve. Just remember that. All law enforcement are there to maintain order and enforce the law. They are not there to protect and serve. Daniel, I saw you come off mute.
Well, and a huge difference is, and Chris can speak to this at length, is they also maintain the jail. That the local sheriff is in charge of the jail. And so, whether the person is being picked up by a police officer, by, an ALE agent, or the deputy sheriff, a lot of times, or almost always, they are taken to the local jail, which is maintained by the sheriff. The sheriff is also, it's an elected position, as Kristie said, but it's also a constitutional position. And so it has a lot more weight generally, and especially on policies, has a lot more power than you see with police chiefs a lot of times.
Yes, the sheriff is the highest law enforcement official in a county, who can only be arrested by the medical examiner. We learned that in 2018 when we were researching the duty of the sheriff.
I didn't know that.
You can only be arrested by the medical examiner. Oh, so county school board. The local school board is a critical public link to public schools. School board members serve their communities in several important ways. First and foremost, school boards look out for students. Education is not a line item on the school board's agenda. It is the only item. School boards are accessible to the public and accountable for their performance of their schools, well, in theory, and school boards ensure that students get the best education for the tax dollars spent. So that is what their role is supposed to look like. And so this little graphic here tells you what lives where. Like sometimes people complain about the water, and if they live in the city, they need to contact the city about the water, not the county about the water. But if you're calling about the health department having an issue, that would be the county that you would address that with, not the city. And so this breaks down like what happens if you have an issue with the streets. Probably going to be your city if you live in the city limits. If you live in the county, it could be the county. And so it helps you kind of look at what issues you may be having in your community and who may address those issues. Now, there are some counties in North Carolina that don't have any cities that are incorporated. So all services are at the county level, okay? So there are some rural counties that don't have any cities in them, and they only have county services. And so all of their needs would be, and I want to say Caratuck, out on the coast is that way. I don't think they have any incorporated cities, and everything is at the county level. All right. And again, we're going to share this with you all. You'll have this. I know you can't see it. It's super small. So,
well, Kristie, can I just make one point before I move on? Sorry. So one huge difference between sort of how the federal system works between the federal government and North Carolina, for example, and how North Carolina relates to its local governments, like a city or a county, is that in the federal system, basically, if a sort of power is not specifically identified as a federal power in the Constitution, then it is assumed that it's a state power, right? So that means that the inherent power is from the states that then agree to give it to the federal government in a constitution. In North Carolina, it works the opposite way, where the sort of foundational political system is the state. And so the state has the inherent power and then delegates the authority to local government, so the county or the city. And that's a huge difference, because it means that unless a city or county can identify somewhere specific in a law that's been passed by the legislature, where they can basically hang their hat and say, you know, this law that was passed gives us the ability to pass this ordinance. Unless they can do that, then they can't. They can't just pass a law because they don't have inherent power. Now, you see this locally with HB2 and with also the living wage that was out there, where if a local government, and this, what triggered my thought on this was I saw the comment about all politics is local. And that is a true sentiment in many regards. But what we see in North Carolina is that it may be a local issue, but the legislature is more than willing to swoop in and subjugate the will of the local will to whatever sort of radical ideas they're enforcing at that time.
And at some point in this, we'll break down Dillon's rule, not tonight, Dillon's rules and home rules. And like, because some states are Dillon's rules, some states are home rules, and North Carolina is neither. It doesn't ascribe to, it's like a hodgepodge of things. I don't think it's clearly one or the other, and no one would say it is, but we'll get into that. And that, what Daniel just talked about, why the legislature can swoop in and do that, is set up into that Dillon rules or home rule state. And their ability to do that is because of, there is a very gray area around it. So now, does my vote influence policy? And that's been a question, and we're going to really talk about that for just a second. Nearly, again, every aspect of our daily lives are regulated by the government, policies, how fast we drive, the conditions of the roads we drive on, the quality of the air we breathe or the water that we drink, healthcare, food, housing, how many police there are, what weapons the police have and use, how many kids are in their classroom. Daniel and I could go on and on and on. who we vote for and what they stand for impacts every aspect of our daily lives. And because they decide what becomes policy and what they spend money on. I know what y'all gonna say. Kristie, the conditions of living and existing for Black and brown folks in North Carolina and in this country as a whole has not advanced over the last 50 years since the Voting Rights Act was passed. So do our votes really matter? Studies show y'all that there is a relationship between the public's opinions and the policy that is being pursued, suggesting that voters do influence government policy. But those findings confirm the importance of high turnout. And, what we do know is that, this is really bad, y'all. It's just going on its own, Daniel. Hold on. This happens every time we present, if I'm not mistaken. It just has a life of its own sometimes. So, the high turnout. But we also understand that there are very real barriers to high turnout, especially in Black and brown communities. Voter suppression is real. When you go to a poll and you stand in a line that is hours long, that is voter suppression, y'all. There is no reason that it should take hours of standing in line to cast a ballot. We have the technology, we have the infrastructure, the money is there. They just refuse to spend it. Daniel, do you want to weigh in? So I know people think I just be radical, but I want them to understand that this is a real thing, that they try to convince us that our votes don't really matter, but if they didn't, then why are they trying to not allow us? When I think of Fannie Lou Hamer, who was a sharecropper in the 40s in Mississippi, who wanted to vote, who endured beatings after beating after beating for just trying to register to vote. If her vote didn't matter, then why were they so dead set against her and the people in her community voting?
Yeah, and even we see it, in 2016, one of the most egregious things that happened was that the Board of Elections sent elected DAs across the state a list of every person with a felony conviction who was not eligible to vote but voted. So there were like 400 of those, and virtually every, I don't think they found any that where the person intentionally knew that they couldn't vote. All of them, or the vast majority, were mistakes, and yet 12 people were prosecuted in Alamance County, which was one of the DAs that took it up. And it's just towards your point, Kristie, yes, it clearly has an effect, just as indicated by the suppression effort. And so, and those things are highly impactful. It doesn't matter how often we get out there and tell people, yeah, you can vote as soon as you get off paper, as soon as you finish your sentence, you can vote. If they hear about people being prosecuted for voting with a felony conviction. And so, we just had this, not us, but our members of our coalition had this huge victory last week that says when somebody is on probation or post-release supervision, even if they have from a felony conviction, that they can still vote. It's going to be very hard to convince people to actually do that because they saw the prosecutions that happened a few years ago. And so it all adds up together and definitely indicates just how powerful a vote can be. No, I'll stop there.
But it also, there are very real, not just barriers to voting that people have, but, I'm going to say this. When you stand in line for hours and hours and hours, and you finally cast that vote for that person who said that they were going to do for your community what they needed to do for your community, and that thing never happens, it makes it very difficult for Black and brown folks to believe in a system that still has not resulted in the conditions of their existence changing. It's just it gets harder and harder to convince people that voting actually matters when their lives, the conditions of their lives, aren't getting better. And so this is for our co-conspirators, for our white allies. This is where you all come in, because it is through your advocacy that you talk to your legislators about what you see happening and how voter suppression looks like. There's getting ready to be a huge conversation around redistricting and all of these things, and being involved in those conversations and showing up is going to be important, because preserving our rights is a fundamental part of the work that we are engaging in. And we don't have enough rights. They are constantly attacking the few that we do have and trying to take those away. And so voting is not the end all be all. It is just one of the tools in our toolbox that we use, but we also recognize it may not be the most efficient, effective, or fastest way to provide relief to Black and brown people who are suffering daily. That's my disclaimer. And I'm a person who couldn't vote until I was in my 30s because of felony conviction. So, yeah, Lord. So, I know what you may be saying, Kristie, it's kind of boring. You know what I'm saying? We done went through 9th grade civics again. Like, I ain't need all this. But why are y'all doing this? Remember that a truly democratic society relies on its members to be informed, not just informed, but ready to act. What good is a government of the people, for the people, by the people, if the people themselves have no idea what their role entails or to what civil rights they are entitled? So why do you need to know? Hopefully you feel more empowered to participate in government processes and proceedings by knowing who is who and what they do and the limitations that government has. This is going to be an ongoing conversation. It's not going to be a one-off conversation that we will be having. We will, in our future presentations, we will be relying on what we learned tonight to continue to investigate how we as a community want to show up as informed residents and members of a community, as well as ready to act, not just informed, but again, ready to act. So we're getting ready to take questions here in just a little bit, but just wanted to let you know before we go through all that, our next event in this educational series will be Manufactured Scarcity via Budgets 101. We're going to talk about how much is in that slush fund that the state has right now. Daniel, at last count in November or December last year, I can't remember when it was like in the 6 billion. So it's probably like 8 or 9 billion right now, I would say, with the way that money accrues and interest. So the state has a slush fund, y'all, and we're going to be learning about, is there a slush fund in your local community? How are your parks in your community? Is there art in your community? Like, what's happening in your community that you feel like is not happening that could happen if it had some money put behind it? And so we'll start talking about how, again, the poverty and the scarcity that we see is actually manufactured, that there's actually enough tax revenue generated to fund everything. And then if you've been a part of our Renegade Advocacy series that we launched as well, that's where we learn about the carceral state and the toxic role of various actors in the carceral state. And so we'll be learning about the toxic role of Governor Cooper in the carceral state. And that's going to happen on September the 9th at 6:30. Again, be on the lookout for details on our website. You'll be getting an email regarding that. And I would not have been able to do this if I did not have the assistance, love, and support of Dr. Felicia Arriaga at North Carolina SPAN, which is the North Carolina Sheriff Police Accountability Network, which is a part of North Carolina Black-led Organizing Collective, and Charlotte for Black Futures. None of this would have been possible without their partnership. And so a huge shout out to those organizations for partnering with us on this. And so now we are getting ready to take questions, and I'm getting ready to stop sharing my screen in a second. All right, so I'm getting ready to check the chat to see any questions that may exist, because I don't see any in the question and answer feature. Okay. I thought I saw somebody ask, about the Council of State, Daniel. What is their role and like, who are those folks? I think that was Ken Rose who asked that. Hey, Ken. Come off mute though.
So in other states, all of those individuals would, or basically all of those powers would reside with the governor as the executive power, but it's spread out in North Carolina. So they are, Elaine Marshall was a Secretary of State. Like the people who you generally hear about and know their names, you would not usually, I don't think you'd hear about them as much if they were cabinet members. But I think a lot of people think they are cabinet members, but and there is a separate cabinet, and so that's the thing, is a Secretary of State, for example, is one of these, Council of State, basically positions, and sort of, that's a sort of the agency around it is completely in control of that person. Whereas like the Department of Public Safety, which is a huge agency, that is a cabinet level position, and Governor Cooper controls that completely. And so, but that's one of the things, is it really depends on, if you're criticizing the Commissioner of Insurance and expect Roy Cooper to do anything about it, he doesn't have the power to do that. So it really just is an important aspect and distinction to acknowledge, and it can be very impactful on how you advocate for certain policy changes that in other states would be completely in the control of the governor, but in North Carolina, he has nothing to do with it.
Right. And so I see some questions in here too about gerrymandering, and just know that the census data has been released. And people are working right now to fight for fair maps to be drawn in North Carolina. Daniel, do you want to speak a little bit about gerrymandering? I can tell you that what the Republican legislature has done, as according to, now this wasn't my words, this is the words of the judge who wrote the decision, that they gerrymandered, they drew these lines along race with surgical precision. And I think the best example of that is we look at the campus of North Carolina A&T University, where that campus was split into like, how many precincts, Daniel? It was like 4 or 5 districts, it was ridiculous. And so like, if I live in this particular dorm, I might want to walk across to the student union and vote, but would get there and be told, actually, you can't vote here because this is not your precinct. And so gerrymandering is rampant in North Carolina. And the question is, Daniel, how would people fight back against that?
Yeah. So gerrymandering is one of the sort of worst features of this, of the sort of abuses that we see. It's a bipartisan issue across the country, but obviously in North Carolina, especially over the last 11 years, the majority party has been ruthless in sort of how they've done it, and only limited by litigation. And so first, I think it is sort of a demonstration of why you need those limits in the policy discussions and deliberations, that you have to have some sort of constitutional limits that are enforced through litigation. And so that's what you're seeing in the gerrymandering context, where it wasn't people going and bearing their souls and speaking authentically and honestly, and if there were people to persuade persuasively to legislators in hearings around the state, like they go through each time the formalities of it, but at the end of the day, a lot of times what we see is they're going to do what they're going to do, and if they're restrained enough, which is not even that restrained, only when you go all out and are just so ruthless about it that it can't even be hidden in a veneer of legitimacy, that's when a court will step in. But they are giving wide latitude and given political advantage. So it's not just that they do it a little bit unfair when they redistrict, it's that they do it to an extreme amount. And so, that's the dynamic there. What I hear right now is they're going to start those conversations later this month. And a lot of Democrats already feel like the maps have already been drawn. But with that said, local governments are working with citizens to fight against this and to amplify voices. And so, for example, I know the Greensboro City Council put together a sort of citizens redistricting committee to lift up these issues and to fight against what they know is coming, which is that their districts the Greensboro is going to be cut up in a lot of the ways that Kristie just said. As A&T as an example, it's going to be cut up in a way that cannot be defended and is only justified if you're trying to dilute power. And so, that's one way, is to plug into these local government conversations where the local government is also trying to defend themselves. And so, you know, I don't trust any decision maker who's not acting in their own interest. And so, you know, you have to look for these situations where, you know, the local government is acting in its own interest to defend you against the state government in this example.
Thank you, Daniel. And then there was another question. Are the branches, the three branches of government, co-equal in North Carolina?
Only in like a vague way. I mean,
that's why I let you answer. I was like, well,
I mean, I think that's probably how they might describe it, but the leverage that you see is incredible. I mean, one, we've already talked about how the governor is disempowered in North Carolina, though he still has plenty of power, still looking for him to exercise clemency, you know, so we'll talk about that on September 9th. But you know, the legislature, even though they're co-equal, the legislature far and away has the most power in virtually every state government. And the federal government may be a little bit different. It's the way it's written in the Constitution actually reflects a more powerful legislature, but just the way the presidency has expanded and gotten a lot more power over the last 150 years in particular, especially the last 75 years in the United States, that yes, it's co-equal, but the president still has an outsized amount of power.
All right, and so we only have probably time for one more question. And the one that I see is someone asking about which judges do we elect? And I think what they're trying to say is, are all judges in North Carolina elected? And yes, the only judicial officials who are not elected in North Carolina are magistrates. And magistrates are the folks that when you are arrested, you see them. And I'm sure magistrates do other stuff, don't they, Daniel? Don't they do something besides just sit up in the jail all day?
You know, I don't deal with magistrates that much, but they don't. Well, I mean, they set bail, but they also, I mean, I get them confused. Like clerks have a huge amount of power.
Do all the paperwork and all the yes, but the magistrate is the clerk is elected. You know, the clerk of court is elected, but the magistrates are the only judicial officials who are not elected. They are appointed. They actually you can just hire. Yes, and they can do weddings and stuff like civil weddings. Okay. I forgot about that. That's what they do. But all the other judges, district court judges, superior court judges, a court of appeals, Supreme Court, all of those judges are elected, and they are elected for very long times, in my opinion, in North Carolina. And how do you find out about a judge's decision? Well, the Court of Appeals has all of their decisions online, as does the North Carolina Supreme Court. As far as what happens in your local courtroom, that is a little bit harder information to assess. And a judge doesn't really make, well, it depends on the level of charges, right? So like in district court, if a judge makes a decision, I mean, you probably won't know about it. If it's a high profile case of a jury, then you may know what the outcome was, but that would again be a jury decision, not the judge's decision. And so we can do a whole thing about judges at some point, but hopefully you got a lot of information tonight. I know you have a lot more questions than we were able to answer tonight, but feel free to attend our next session and ask those questions then. If it's a really pressing issue, feel free to email me or Daniel. We will answer your questions as best as we can. But with that, Daniel, do you have anything else you want to say before we sign off?
No, I just appreciate you leading us through this. And I think that people can learn a lot. And again, it's about sort of protecting yourselves and your communities, but also, you know, we're excited to engage in renegade advocacy. And there are pressure points here. Like there's plenty of barriers to you contributing and changing public policy. But I think through this course, we'll be able to identify some tactics where you can get past that and actually influence policy at all different levels.
Yes. Oh, and we had a comment. The magistrates, Daniel, also issue those domestic violence warrants, orders for arrest. They also do warrants for people, sign warrants for people, and all kind of little stuff on the administratively on the back end. So thank y'all so much. We will see y'all in a few weeks. Please join us on September the 9th for the Talks and Roll of Governor Cooper. And then again at the end of next month on September the 23rd, where we have our second iteration. Good night. Be well.